This is The Red Line, where we talk to three expert witnesses about one issue shaping the news both here and overseas. Guns for hire is nothing new. It was one of the first ever professions, exchanging money for protection. And this has been serious business for a long time now. But today, things have escalated from a purely protectional role and have spiraled into full offensive roles, with hit squads, propaganda networks, and even government changes, all now waging an unchecked war with everything from Soviet hand grenades through to Chinese airborne drones. PMCs, or private military companies, have become rife in the battlefields of the world today, from fighting terrorists in Nigeria to protecting oil fields in Western China. More and more people are turning to these unregulated contract soldiers to do their dirty work. Is this the future of warfare? Company versus company? Or is this a disturbing trend that sees governments palming off the nastiest parts of war to someone else to theoretically keep their hands clean for the voters? Well, for that, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. Blurring the Line.
PMCs are private military companies, but they have many names: private security companies, contingency contractors. But essentially, we're talking about armed civilians who fight in a paramilitary style for profit in foreign wars. Many people around the world consider them to be a little more than mercenaries.
Sean McFate is one of the world's biggest experts on PMCs, having even debated Erik Prince on the Al Jazeera network. He is a professor of strategy at Georgetown University, as well as the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. He is also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and has done multiple tours for the US Army and as a PMC himself. And he joins us today.
And mercenaries kind of went underground for about 150 years. And after the Cold War ended, they started to pop back up in South Africa, of all places, executive outcomes. But the market really kicked into full gear when the United States went into Iraq and Afghanistan and used them extensively. And now that the US is no longer using them, they've gone and found new clients, and those clients are states, but they're also big companies and super rich individuals.
So how does a PMC's role differ from, let's say, a standard grunt soldier's role?
Well, many of the personnel come from the military. I am one. I served as a paratrooper in the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division as an officer, and then I sort of, they say, went to the dark side. I went to the PMC world, some would say the mercenary world, and most of my colleagues who were at the pointy end of the stick, as they say, were like me, but they're from nations across the world. I served with special operations guys from Latin America, from Australia, from everywhere. So the job that they do is, the skill sets are very similar, but there's some key differences too. Well, the first is that they have to be conflict entrepreneurs. And they have to sort of check their ideology on the side. If there's if you're a very hardcore soldier, you never hang up your holsters to work for a company whose main goal is profit. That would be seen as disloyal to your cause of the Australia or the United States of America. But these soldiers are a little bit more, shall we say, morally flexible, and they try to find opportunities for their companies. And we're talking about complex post-conflict places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. There's always more work to be done, whether it's legitimate or illegitimate.
And what theaters are we seeing PMCs in? What countries are they most active?
So the conflict markets are what draw PMCs and mercenaries. I'm going to use those words a little loosely and interchangeably right now. So where we're seeing them right now are all over Eastern Ukraine, Syria, Iraq. Yemen has a lot. Parts of Horn of Africa, Congo is like a never-ending conflict market. We're seeing Nigeria use them against Boko Haram. We have seen them in Venezuela. Basically, any place there's a conflict market, that's the demand that attracts mercenary supply.
So let's stay with Yemen for a second. If a PMC was to flaunt the rules of a country, shoot a civilian, commit war crimes, who are they accountable to?
Well, no one really knows. And this is one of the selling points of PMCs. The reason, and we can talk about this in a bit, the reason we're seeing their widespread and increased and growing use amongst the entire world is that they sell plausible deniability, and this really matters in information age. Warfare is changing. And one of the things that you might want to hire a PMC to do, as we've seen a lot of governments do, is you want them to do the really high risk stuff that you don't want to do, or you want them to do really nasty things that you don't want your own soldiers doing, like potentially human rights violations. Because if they get caught, they give good plausible deniability. They can say, we don't know who we work for. Or even if they do get caught, who's going to try them? So just say you have, I'm just making this up, you have a Ugandan private military contractor wipes out a family in Yemen on a UAE contract, okay? So where is he tried? He tried in Yemen, where the crime happened? Is he tried in Uganda, where he's from? Is he tried at the UAE, who's the client? Or is he not tried at all because it's a complete blipping mess? It's the last. And that's one reason, I think, why we're seeing the growth of this industry, is because they allow you to commit crimes kind of with impunity.
So is there a limit to what they can use? Are they just using rifles and grenades, or are they actually having access to big things like artillery and drones?
They can use anything they can get their hands on. I mean, one of the interesting things about this sector, the private military sector, is that they sort of bring some of the innovation of the private sector into warfare. So you don't have these massive bureaucracies which take 15 years and several billions of dollars to develop something. They can take something cheap offline, they can find it on the web, and they can modify it. They can get a drone, they can modify it into a kamikaze drone fleet. Right? They're getting increasingly more sophisticated. Mercenaries, for example, also, they could be really hardcore. So Nigeria had a Boko Haram problem, and Boko Haram, as your listeners know, it's a extreme, violent Islamic terrorist group, sort of like ISIS, in Nigeria. And for 6 years, the Nigerian military could not contend with Boko Haram inside of Nigeria's borders. And the Nigerian military is not a weak military. In 2015, the Nigerian government secretly hired a bunch of mercenaries who came mostly from South Africa area and former Soviet republics. They showed up with Mi-24 Hind helicopters. These are like Russian flying tank helicopters that the Russians used in the Afghan War. They showed up with special operations units that are equal to special SAS or SBS, and they did a search and destroy, and within weeks, they pushed up Boko Haram from Nigeria. Even if the world says, we know you did it, it's really hard to hold them accountable for that. So mercenaries just offer one more layer of plausible deniability. Does it fool everybody? No. But does it complicate holding people accountable? Yes, it does.
So keeping on the weapon capabilities, if these guys were to launch chemical weapons or some sort of illegal weapon on behalf of a nation state, who would end up being accountable for that?
Well, it would be difficult because they offer a layer of plausible deniability. It's not like you catch a bunch of little green men in Ukraine. You can say they're obviously Russian. You can hire special operations units. Now these are not just like the lone dudes in the Congo that we see in bad Hollywood movies. These are highly sophisticated, highly capable expertise at the very top. At the very bottom, it's a swamp. But at the very top, they have some real legit tier one capabilities. And if you wanted to use them to deploy WMD and make it, to use a bad pun, murky about who is behind it, it's a new weapon of choice that we should be concerned about.
And you said tier one there. What is a tier one capability?
So tier one is a highly skilled elite trooper like a SAS, SBS, Delta, SEAL, stuff like that. So we have those, and it's not just from countries like Russia. We have Tier 1 ex-SEALs, ex-Green Berets working as mercenaries in Yemen as hit squads for Middle East monarchies.
And what roles do they take? What are the jobs of PMCs?
One thing they can do is direct action, which is sort of, force on force. They can also do professionalizing your armed forces or militia. So you send them in, you have a militia group or you have a military and you want to make them better and they'll train and equip them. You can also have them do strategic reconnaissance. And oil companies use them. Extractive industry uses them for that purpose. Like they want to go into the Katanga in the Congo. It's a mineral-rich, lawless area for the most part, and find out, so who's who in the zoo. They can do all, and they work with private intelligence as well.
So if they aren't technically a part of the nation's military, are they receiving the classified briefings and information? A private company getting given information on upcoming offensives?
Well, if it's a government client asking them to do a government thing on the lowdown, then they might get a classified brief, maybe illegally, or if they're working for the government, whether it's like when I was in the industry, I held clearances and I still use them, and I did work for the U.S. government in Africa. Wagner Group, who works for the GRU in Russia, which is the military intelligence agency, probably gets the same. At least the top leadership does. Is that legal by the domestic laws of that country? It's hard to say.
So I'm curious, do these guys get in with a tourist visa or do they come in on a working visa? How do they get into the country?
No, they can enter as tourists. They can enter illegally. They could enter under the auspices of the client government, or they can enter on the auspices of, a mining company or oil company hires them under their special work visa program or something like that. There's all sorts of ways they can infiltrate a country.
So the big proposal that keeps getting thrown around by people like Erik Prince is the privatizing of the Afghan War, replacing NATO with private soldiers. Do you think this is a good idea?
The idea that 6,500 mercenaries can pacify Afghanistan in 12 months or less is ludicrous. Even if you do create a private military force, how do you control it? You're vulnerable to Praetorianism. And Praetorianism is, if you think about the Roman Praetorian Guard, they're the elite bodyguard of Roman emperors who later on became not just the gatekeepers Roman emperors, but they sort of had palace coups and took over and even auctioned off the Roman emperor's seat at one point. So controlling mercenaries is hard. What happens if they go into league with the Taliban or with narcos selling poppies? This is one of the oldest problems of the market for force is contract enforcement, safety, and accountability.
So in the event of, let's say, a handover of Afghanistan to the PMCs, would that also leave control of the country's resources to the PMCs?
So Erik Prince's plan was that he was going to mine rare earth minerals from North Afghanistan and presumably get them to market by building railroads and selling them through China, right? And the problem is what happens if the mercenaries become a de facto kingdom around the mines? And we've seen a lot of history of that in the Middle Ages and even in the last 30 years where mercenaries are worried about, frankly, being screwed by their employer, so they work out a barter system where they control like a diamond mine or an oil field or something like that. But then at that point, they're like a small feudal kingdom, and that's not pacifying or quote unquote fixing Afghanistan. That's creating another thing to fight in Afghanistan. It's not helping.
So a lot of individuals serve in the armed forces to defend and protect their country, but PMCs are a company and they don't necessarily have a country. Do you see cases of, let's say, American PMCs taking money from other nations to work against their own birth country?
Well, this is the central question of, look, the question, there's a couple questions here this is an important question you raise. One is that it really depends on the individual. Because if you think about it, there's a spectrum between a pure soldier and a pure mercenary. And most people are somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, where they do something purely for ideological, patriotic reasons, or they do something purely for money, no matter how unethical the deed. Not all mercenaries, in my experience, will do something evil just for the paycheck. There's a lot of American mercenaries and contractors I know who would never work for China, as Erik Prince has done. There's also soldiers who don't want to serve in the U.S. military, but they reenlist because they get a $90,000 reenlistment bonus, which is quite transactional and would make most contractors salivate. So that's kind of mercenary-like too, but it's happening in the U.S. Army. So we're all somewhere in that middle spectrum. But I do think it raises important questions about how, when you privatize war, it changes warfare in profound ways, because suddenly market strategies enter the world of warfare. It's like Adam Smith meets Clausewitz. And there are strategies you can now use in war to defeat your enemy by like buying out their mercenaries, by retaining all the mercenaries in a region to deny your enemy a defense. These were commonly known strategies during the era, say, of Machiavelli and the Middle Ages in Renaissance Italy. But today they're forgotten by almost every four-star general. And we're entering a world which is becoming increasingly privatized warfare, where these strategies matter more and more, and we're not prepared for it.
So I know this isn't a new problem, but how do you think the PMC market has changed over just the last 10 years?
10 years ago, it wasn't really a free market. It was something called a monospony, which means that there was one big sugar daddy client that was the United States government in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they kind of dictated the rules of the road because they had market power. Now it's like a free agent. It's a free market where you have supply and demand, and they ratchet each other up. And remember that mercenaries, force private security contractors, it's the one commodity that you cannot regulate by law. Because, who's going to go in to Yemen and arrest all those mercenaries or all those contractors? Nobody. The UN's not going to do it. No nation state's going to do it, because those contractors can shoot your law enforcement dead. They can resist arrest. And that's why those who think we can turn to international law, the United Nations, to control this problem are frankly dreaming. We have resurrected a mercenary trade that was it's going to become akin to the Middle Ages in a couple more decades, and it's going to change global politic power. I mean, the super rich will have more power, the Fortune 500, super rich individuals, they're going to have more power than the many states, and that's going to be a very different world.
After the Iraq War, PMCs have exploded in popularity amongst the international community, often allowing big corporations to wield more military might than small nations. If all the dirty work gets done by an American wearing a PMC badge rather than a flag, do you think the citizens of the invaded countries are likely to see the difference? Or will they hold the grudges all the same? How do these countries feel about PMCs? And why would someone leave their job serving the nation to work for a company who may pay them to fight against it? Well, for that, we turn to our next guest.
Part 2. Bad Reputation.
The first time I actually came across any PMCs, private military contractors, was in 2003. And there's a certain section that was actually sectioned off to ensure protection of the citizens that live there. And at one point, there was a convoy of private military contractors that pulled up, and come to find out that they were actually escorting Paul Bremer. And for those that remember who Paul Bremer was, he was actually the first ambassador, if I'm not mistaken, to between the U.S. and Iraq.
Alex Kirsch is a sergeant first class in the U.S. Army who has served 4 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. He is also the host of the Depth of Perspective podcast, which talks all things U.S. politics and the armed forces. Alex is an active member of the military, and all views here are expressed are his own and not those of the U.S. military. He joins us today.
One of the first big times was there was a time we were rolling outside to conduct a standard patrol, traveling up and down MSR Tampa. For those that have actually served, people know Tampa. Tampa was one of the most dangerous or frequently traveled routes aside from Route Irish. And there was this one time we were not too far away from a private military contractor convoy, and there was a car that was pulled off to the side of the road. And, we thought we'd check that out because it was very suspicious, and there was a family in there. And the family actually talked about how, at the time, the rules of engagement essentially meant that if a vehicle was in front of you, you had to follow your escalation of force. You had to show that you're coming through, and they had to get out of the way kind of deal. Well, I guess these guys didn't want to wait for them to get out of the way, because as the family pulled off, they claimed that these private military contractors threw a rock into their window, and it injured one of their children, actually. And, I really can't say because we didn't see it, but we saw the convoy drive by, and it seemed like the car hadn't been there that long.
So how were they viewed on the base? What did the average soldier think of them?
A lot of them talked about how when they got out of the military, they went right back into being private military contractors because they had more freedom to do things. Like, they talked about how much more freedom they had to do, because even though there was, when it comes down to being deployed downrange, you have to follow the rules of engagement. You have to follow the law of war. Now, people would say there's no such thing as a law of war. However, the United States military, they take pride in that. We do take pride in that, because the thing is, if you don't follow rules, if you treat everybody like, if you just start treating people poorly, or if you start massacring people, then what are you fighting for? But these guys say, well, the rules are a little bit loose with us. Now, I'm pretty sure anybody could say that, but I would hear them share the stories they would have about how many people they went out and say, man, it was so fun to kill some people. And it was kind of disturbing to hear this stuff, because, you really shouldn't brag about, people, like that you kill necessarily, because it's one thing to take on the enemy and to wipe the enemy out, because it's either you or them. But it seems like these guys were gloating like it was something glorious about it, which I kind of had a bit of a problem with at the time. I mean, even thinking about it now, in a way, kind of turns my stomach away, because, I get it. You're there for a reason. War is not a pretty thing. It's not meant to be a pretty thing. War is a very graphic detail, and there's a lot of horrible things that goes on downrange. But the thing is, though, is you can't be absolutely horrified by when you hear things that, like, what the Taliban does or ISIS does, but then you hear stories about people, that we're supposed to stand for something, that do the same thing. Granted, they're not in the military anymore, but they're still a part of our country. People remember stuff like that.
So does a PMC soldier get paid more than a regular soldier?
Well, I know they get paid more, but they actually are not allowed to tell you how much they make. But being a private military contractor, or a contractor of any sort, whether it's working as security, or if you're just working, like, there's people that work under government military contracts, they get paid a lot of money, but they're not allowed to tell you how much money they make, actually. That's something they actually have to sign a contract, apparently, indicating how much they actually make.
In your opinion, do you think PMCs are a good idea, or do you think they may be a long-term problem?
Because the thing is, it's not necessarily a black and white statement right there, because there has been times in the past where anybody on either side has gone a little too far. But the thing is, like, if you've got somebody in charge that's able to maintain order and discipline with guys and say, listen, you're not here to be a cowboy. You're not here to win a war. You're here for a specific job right here. Because you've got private military contractors that help with maritime security at times, but that's just because, like, you and I have talked about how maritime security is a real big deal. They're there to protect these cargo liners that are being hijacked by these pirates. They're there for that specific reason, which is a very, very important task, because, these pirates are very well armed. So again, it all kind of goes back into, are these guys mandated under certain laws and principles? Are they going to follow the same codes and rules that the soldiers have to apply to? Because if they're not going to, then how exactly are they going to be helping us, the United States military, in the long run? Because people will remember you. They're not going to care that you're just a private military contractor. If you do a bad thing and you're from the United States, that's all people are going to remember, is that you're from the United States. That's the only thing they're going to know.
So one of the main proposals for PMCs is the privatization of the Afghan War. So what's your thoughts on that, and what do you think the likely outcome would be if that were to happen?
I think it's kind of a disaster waiting to happen, honestly. Because the thing is, the one thing that the military is trying to do right now is ensure that we give the Afghan military and the Afghan government enough credibility to take their own country over. And they're doing that with combat advisors right now. The thing is that if you send a bunch of guys in that have maybe little to no experience in that regard, how is it they're going to change the way that war is fought? Especially when it comes to dealing with the Taliban, because the Taliban are going to remember who Erik Prince is. We have to remember something. The Taliban are not a bunch of fools. They're not just guys that sit in a cave. These guys are smart. They're going to do their research on their enemy. They're going to know their enemy just as well as they know themselves. So does anybody really think that the Taliban is just going to see these guys and say, oh, well, let's not mess with these guys? The Taliban have been fighting people for decades. And I don't think it's really going to be any different, regardless of who it might be.
It is well known in the armed forces the reputation these PMCs have both in base and in the community. But is this a reputation across all nations? Well, to figure that out, we're going to take a look at the two biggest PMCs in the world. Frontier Services Group, the successor to Blackwater run by Erik Prince, mostly working for the US, and the Wagner Group, founded by Russian oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin, working mostly for the Russian GRU. This week we have two guests who specialize in each of these companies and are going to help us lay out how they operate, who funds them, and where they are active, as well as where they're about to be active. So for now, let's turn to our third guest and talk about US PMCs and how they operate around the world.
Part 3. The Good Old Boys.
So I think the role of PMCs is going to be increasing in 2020, especially as we see countries trying to withdraw troops, especially states like the United States. The US is actually one of the largest users of PMCs, but at the same time, we have an administration that is really concentrated on reducing the number of troops and reducing US military commitments. But even if the US reduces its troops, it will have to fill the gap with somebody. And that is where PMCs will come in.
Sahar Khan is a fellow at the CATO Institute and a member of the Leadership Council for the American Pakistan Foundation. She is also an expert on US PMCs, in particular their roles in Iraq and Afghanistan. And she joins us today.
So if the Trump administration is reelected, for example, and if President Trump does withdraw troops from Syria, Afghanistan, even various other Middle Eastern posts, they will potentially be filled by private military and security companies.
So let's talk about the most well-known PMC group, Blackwater, run by Erik Prince. The group which became infamous for their work in Iraq and is now based in Hong Kong and call themselves Frontier Services Group. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So both Blackwater and Frontier Services Group is associated with Erik Prince. And so Erik Prince, just to even talk about who he is a former Navy SEAL who was deployed with SEAL Team 8, and he was deployed to Haiti, the Balkans, and various other Middle East locations. And he left the Navy SEALs in 1995, and then he started Blackwater in 1997. And he says, and this is according to his autobiography, he says that he's been really passionate about increasing operational support, and especially he's been focused on increasing the need for private facilities and training for special operations. And so that motivation took him to establish Blackwater in 1997. And even when we think about how Blackwater was established, I mean, he essentially moved to Virginia Beach and bought like 6,000 acres of land, which is about 24 square kilometers, and just established a school for, operational training. So that's where Blackwater was born. Now, Blackwater played a really big role in, I would say, the Iraq War, like pre-invasion and even post-invasion. Blackwater essentially, functions as a private company, and it won a lot of government contracts, and essentially the government outsourced a lot of the services that I mentioned before, like weapons procurement, personal security, military training, etc. They outsourced it to Blackwater and similar companies. Now, for the most part, Blackwater, I don't want to say that they were doing fine, but they were sort of functioning in a space where people weren't paying that much attention to them. But that changed in 2007. And so just very briefly, in September 2007, there was a convoy of Blackwater contractors that was guarding U.S. State Department employees. And they went to a crowded square in Baghdad. And when they were there, that's sort of the only fact that everybody agrees on. And the story then sort of diverges. And so Blackwater says that they were attacked, and so they responded by following the rules of engagement, and they essentially shot at a car that also had a family in it. And in response, Iraqi police also began firing, and it ended up resulting in 20 civilians dying, and including the family who was in the car. Now, Iraqi police and local witnesses say that that's not necessarily what happened. The convoy was going on its way. People were moving out of its way on the road. There's one car that did not move out of its way, and it seems that the Blackwater guards thought that was a threat, and they opened fire, and that's sort of when things went downhill. I mean, long story short, Iraq was outraged. Iraqi Prime Minister at the time, Nouri al-Maliki, called the killings a crime, and there was a lot of public support for his statement as well. And Iraqi people essentially demanded some accountability from Blackwater, and not just Blackwater, but essentially from the United States. And I think that's when sort of the world even started paying a little more attention to private military security companies. So Blackwater has since sort of dismantled, and this happened in 2007. And long story short, there were about 3 guards who were convicted in October of 2014, I believe, on like 14 manslaughter charges, and that's where Blackwater got its bad name. But that didn't really stop Erik Prince. He moved on to start Frontier Services Group, and the Frontier Services Group differs from Blackwater in the sense that it's not concentrated just on Iraq. It's actually it's based in Hong Kong, and it's an African-focused security, aviation, and logistics company. And they again provide a range of services that I talked about before. And one of the interesting things I think about Frontier Services is that Chinese stakeholders actually play a big role in the group. So these are the 2 main, I would say, private military security companies that people know about. But I want to stress that these are not the only ones. There are virtually hundreds of them operating all over the world.
So it's a well-known fact that Prince has a very close tie with the Bush and Trump White Houses, having frequent meetings with cabinet members from both administrations. How and why is Prince so close to these governments?
So, I think that's a great question. He is very closely tied to the White House, and a lot of people don't know this, but the U.S. Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, is his sister. So anytime Erik Prince says that he doesn't really have any links to the Trump administration, he's essentially, if I could be so bold, he's essentially lying. So Erik Prince has had ties with the Trump administration. He has certainly been accused of almost lobbying for the Trump administration and almost working on his campaign. And in the United States, about a year or so ago, the Trump administration was being investigated by prosecutor Mueller, and the report came out, and Erik Prince was mentioned in the report several times. And so his links, I would say, are both personal and professional. So just considering the role that his sister plays in the administration, considering the amount of meetings that he had with President Trump when he was a presidential candidate, that shows to me that there is certainly a personal link and perhaps even a friendship. Erik Prince is even labeled as sort of the unofficial national security advisor of President Trump. So I think that's sort of, that's not based on empirical information. That's just sort of my observation that there must be a personal link. Now, professionally, Erik Prince, was known for organizing a meeting that took place in 2016 where President Trump had just almost announced that he wanted to be, in the running for president of the United States. And he introduced Lebanese-American businessman George Nader to President Trump. And one of the goals was to facilitate President Trump's rise in the Republican Party and to increase the chances of his bid for the White House. And since then, systematically, Erik Prince has introduced President Trump to various businessmen in the UAE and in Russia that have now links to the Trump administration.
So a few years ago, Prince moved the company from the US to Hong Kong. Why do you think he did that? And do you think there's a bit of a conflict of interest there being so close to the Trump administration?
Well, certainly there's a conflict of interest. I think Erik Prince would probably say that, there really isn't a conflict of interest. It's a private company, and he has, as a U.S. citizen, he has a right to base his company wherever he wants. It doesn't mean that just because you're a U.S. citizen doesn't mean you have to be based in the United States. I think he probably chose Hong Kong because one of the largest shareholders in his company is a Chinese state-owned conglomerate called Cities Group. And so I think that's why he's based in Hong Kong, because it's closer and it's easier to get to Beijing. And as far as a conflict of interest, absolutely, I think there's a conflict of interest, especially with his personal and I would even argue professional ties to the White House.
So we don't usually do this, but let's pose a bit of a hypothetical here. If, for instance, ExxonMobil, a US oil company, was unhappy with the US's tactic for dealing with Venezuela and wanted access to all their oil, could Exxon hire a PMC to help, design, orchestrate, and carry out a coup to topple the Venezuelan government? And this would give Exxon access to the oil and give it the outcome it's been chasing for a long time. At this point, if this was to go ahead, would there be repercussions against ExxonMobil for being a part of this, or would there just be strong words from the government?
Yeah, it would be ExxonMobil who would be liable for that. And I think that's interesting too, right? Generally, what we've seen for private military and security companies is that states tend to hire them, not like private companies. So I'm not saying that that's right or wrong, but for the most part, states are the ones who have been hiring private security companies, not necessarily, I would say, other companies. But that said, if ExxonMobil or any other large oil company did hire somebody like Erik Prince, I think there will definitely be an issue in terms of, legal jurisdiction, who is to be held accountable. Nobody really knows, because even it would depend on which company Erik Prince is using. If he's using Frontier Services and it's based in Hong Kong, and it has Chinese shareholders, is it considered a Chinese company or is it considered an American company? And based on that logic, different laws, it would be subjected to different laws and even different regulatory systems. So I think the problem with PNCs, of course, is that it's really hard to figure out how to regulate them.
So there would likely be so much confusion surrounding this on who is responsible and who can be charged. Exxon may actually get away with no charges and still get the desired outcome they were chasing in the first place.
It's also interesting too, right? When we think about just the fact that you asked me this question, could ExxonMobil hire a PMC? I think that begs the question, well then, are states the only actors in the international system that are important, right? I think that they are not. I think that they're getting competition from really large companies, because if you can have a large company, say BP hires, a PMC because they feel like they need security, and the state that they're, potentially looking for oil in, it doesn't have security services, so they're going to hire, somebody to provide them security. On the surface, it seems like a perfectly logical thing to want. You can't do good business without having security. But I think the issue then becomes also then these businesses are so big, they almost operate like a state. And if they're operating like a state, well then what does that mean then for the international system? And what does that mean then for the state itself, who claims to have a monopoly on the use of force? Because it seems that they don't really have a monopoly anymore.
So Erik Prince keeps popping up in Turkey of all places at the moment. Why do you think he keeps traveling there, and what is he hoping to achieve?
Well, I think he wants, to take over the vacuum that would be created if U.S. troops left Turkey. And so I think that's why he's there. He's sort of lobbying for his services. And I think he wants to present the case that to a lot of stakeholders, especially involved in the Syrian war, and especially who are involved in Turkey. I think he wants to make his case, which is that if U.S. troops withdraw, don't worry, I can provide services that are comparable to the services U.S. troops would provide, because essentially the people that I have are ex-U.S. soldiers. So I think number one, that's why he's there. Second, I think, with the Trump administration and the Trump administration's general stance of reducing the number of troops, I think Erik Prince views this as an opportunity to, promote his business model, which is that wars can be privatized. If wars are privatized, they would run more effectively and potentially end sooner, which I disagree with. I don't think they would end sooner. Because from a logical point of view, if you're in the business of making war, why would you want the war to end, right? Doesn't seem like a good business model, but, we could talk about that further. But yeah, I think he's in Turkey because he wants to sell. This is an opportunity to sell his company and to broaden his services even more.
So Erik is an American with a Republican leaning and very close ties to particularly the Trump White House. He usually works under contract from the USA in the USA's best interests abroad, but given his political leanings and being outside the official system, do you think he would ever work to undermine a Democratic presidential candidate or against a Democratic administration?
Absolutely. And I think you're being really politically correct by saying he's Republican leaning. I mean, he's Republican. I mean, there's no, he wants to run for the Wyoming Senate seat. For now, I mean, this is my guess. He has said openly a couple of times that he would like to run. He could envision himself as running as a senator. And I think it's just a matter of time before we actually see Erik Prince running, if that makes sense. So right now, it's obviously President Trump is going to run for re-election. And if, President Trump wins, then obviously, in 4 years, we're going to see the Republican nomination process. And so I think Erik Prince would potentially try to help the Republican nominee. So it's not that he would necessarily go against or try to counter a Democratic nominee, but I think he would lend support to them. But that said, I mean, I have no idea, because he might have political ambitions himself. He might be running for Senate. So we'll just have to see what he does politically.
So let's look to the future now. Where are we likely to see American PMCs popping up over the next few years?
Well, I would say definitely the Middle East, and which is already happening now, and especially, the Gulf region. If especially if there's some sort of economic peril with Qatar and the UAE, they haven't really diversified their economies, and if oil prices are going the way they are, that might end up being an unstable situation. And Africa, I think Africa is a hotbed for conflict, and I think it will unfortunately remain so. And I actually think that PMCs being involved would probably increase conflict points. And I think we see this in Iraq, right? I mean, we don't necessarily need to look forward and predict. We can look in our past, just recent past, to see the role that PMCs have played. And just Iraq is a classic example of this, that there were many people who were in the United States were advocating for the U.S. to invade Iraq. That has gone horribly wrong, and PMCs have added to the instability, and they have eroded any kind of goodwill that may have existed in Iraqi hearts and minds. And so I don't think PMCs are a solution at all. If our goal is to reduce the number of flashpoints, to reduce war, then privatizing war is not going to do it.
So we've seen how the US's main PMC is fairly opaque when it comes to its allegiances. They work for the US, but they're based in China. They support American democracy, but only for one of the parties. They advocate for trying to shorten wars, but make all their money lengthening them. The more you look into people like Erik Prince, it seems the less you understand where he morally sits. Is it the money, or is it his country that holds his true loyalty? But this is a very different situation to the Russian PMC, the Wagner Group. And to compare these two, we turn to our next guest.
Part 4. From Russia with Arms.
The Wagner Group is a private military security company that has operated in Ukraine, Syria, Libya, Sudan. It has a long history that dates back to the early 2000s during the breakup of the Soviet Union. Most people know the story of the Wagner Group as the story of a man named Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was close to Vladimir Putin for many years back in the day when Putin was deputy mayor in St. Petersburg, and Yevgeny Prigozhin was a hot dog salesman, come caterer. In actual fact, Yevgeny Prigozhin is really just a middleman, a sort of beard, if you will, for a much larger enterprise of networked state enterprises, such as Sovcomflot, Stroytransgaz, and other big shipping and oil and energy companies that are mostly state-owned.
Candace Rondeaux is a senior professor of politics and global studies at Arizona State University, as well as being a senior fellow at the New America think tank. She also wrote the amazing paper Decoding the Wagner Group, and she joins us today.
So the Wagner Group really is just a shorthand for mercenaries that operate on behalf of the Russian state. Unfortunately, they're also a very useful means of Russia's ability to project power. They look like, on paper, a sort of ghost army. In reality, they're really just a series of contingents that work for state enterprises. So in a nutshell, they're really just an extension of the Russian state.
So I want to figure out how close Prigozhin and Wagner are to the Kremlin. You know, during war planning and high-level classified operational meetings in the Kremlin, is Wagner likely to have a seat at the table?
That's a very good question. Likely, yes, today that is the case. But we have to understand Wagner, we have to kind of cast almost all the way back to the 1960s, 1970s. In fact, most weapons and arms deals between the Soviet Union and countries like Syria and other client countries like Sudan were done under an umbrella of military technical agreement. And typically what came with the package, let's say you bought a bunch of tanks or anti-aircraft artillery batteries, typically what would happen is a group of special forces, Spetsnaz as they call them, would be sent along with those materials to help the local army, whether it was Syria or Sudan, train up on how to use them. And they would stay in place. So in fact, well before Wagner appeared on the scene, circa 2013, 2014, there was already a pre-existing kind of line going all the way from Moscow to Damascus. And there were barracks there. Later, after the Soviet Union broke apart, and there was a kind of reorganization of the military-industrial complex in Russia, what ultimately happened was large companies like Gazprom, Stroytransgaz, Sovcomflot, each was allowed to hire their own private army. And, Gazprom back in the 1990s had a private army of something like 30,000 roughly men, many of whom operated abroad because, of course, Gazprom had big business abroad. That was also true of Stroytransgaz, which is a big energy infrastructure producer.
So what would be one of the major differences here between, let's say, Wagner and Blackwater?
Well, they're quite different in the sense that Blackwater is a strictly private enterprise, and it, while it contracts occasionally with governments, and it has contracted, for instance, with the U.S. government. Oftentimes, the contracting mechanisms are strictly private. With the Wagner Group, everything is pretty much state to state. So when, for instance, in 2013, rebel forces overran a major gas plant at Al-Shir, which is a big, huge gas plant. It was one of the few reproduction refineries in the center of Syria. So strategically, it's very important. When that was overrun, ultimately, it was really the Russian state through Concord and Everpolis, this other subsidiary shell company, that ended up contracting the security forces, the Russian security forces that we know as Wagner, to go and take it back, right? But that deal was part of a larger, almost treaty-like arrangement between the Syrian state and Russia.
So Wagner seems far more tied to the Kremlin and its goals than Frontier would be to the White House and its goals. We know Blackwater could possibly be bought off, but what about Wagner? Could the USA, let's say, pay them enough to get them to abandon their war in eastern Ukraine and simply return to Russia?
Yeah, loyalty is a really interesting question to be asking about these troops. The reality is nobody can buy them out because they would never be able to go home again. And that actually points to the level of control that different elements of the Russian Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Interior, Emergency Services Ministry exert over private military security contractors. Many of the folks who sign up to become part of a PMSC that we know as Wagner are extremely poor. They're socially marginalized, they're politically marginalized, they tend to drift toward very right-wing nationalist causes. They really have lost a lot of status, in large part because of the reorganization of the Russian military, which has taken place over a couple different generations. But most recently, in 2012, there was a big shakeup that put a lot of people basically out of work and made for this kind of rolling contracting service. So in actual fact, loyalty is in some ways a little bit about the social pressures and the economic pressures that these members of Wagner are under. It is not always necessarily about, sort of in defense of the motherland, although there is a great deal of patriotism about the mission. So no, I don't think it would be possible for the United States to buy out Wagner. There is no higher bidder than the Russian state when it comes to the Wagner Group.
So where Wagner really made its name was in Ukraine, both in the fighting in Crimea, but also in Luhansk in the east of the country. How did Wagner get started with that war in eastern Ukraine?
Yeah, so what's interesting about Wagner is that it really is, it really only appears on the scene after, as I mentioned, this kind of skirmish that becomes public in Tadmor in 2013. And then suddenly we start to see and hear, bits and bobs about Wagner Group operating on the front lines, first in Crimea, but actually more in Luhansk, which is the district that is part of the Donbass region that has been contested. And it is around 2014 when Alexei Milchakov, who's a young man, he's from St. Petersburg, appears on the scene in Donbass. And a couple of other guys, Dmitry Utkin, start to kind of pop up in Luhansk as things are going quite badly for Russia. They're on the back foot. The Ukrainian forces have managed to push them back. And there's a sort of spring offensive underfoot. And bit by bit, you start to hear, there's these guys with Viking symbols and Nazi symbols popping up all over the place. And eventually they form a sort of little mini platoon and become part of a battalion known as the Batman Group. And the Batman Battalion, was a bunch of special forces, Spetsnaz soldiers, largely from Russia, who were either dropped in, marched in, or floated in across the Black Sea, across the Sea of Azov. And they became kind of this core vanguard to control what was becoming a bunch of banditry. The Donbass rebels who were fighting the Ukrainian government were out of control, looting, stealing, taking people hostages. It was so out of control that the Russian government felt that was part of the discipline problem that led to the Ukrainian forces making so much headway. And so the Wagner Group was really brought in as this sort of disciplinary force on the front line. But they were also very interesting in the sense that they provided an opportunity to promote this sort of heroic vision of the Spetsnaz, Russian Spetsnaz on the rise, battling for the motherland. That is what the Wagner Group is, essentially. It is a mythological sort of handle for the rise of the Russian Spetsnaz and the revival of Russian military power, not only in Ukraine, but across the world.
So I want to get a better idea about Wagner's roles. They're very active in African countries like Libya and Mozambique, but they're particularly busy in the Central African Republic. What are Russian mercenaries doing in this small African country?
So what Wagner seems to be doing in the Central African Republic is supporting mining operations. Mining in places like Central African Republic, places like Sudan, where they also operate, can be a very dangerous job because very valuable materials are being taken out of the ground. And the state tends to want to protect those valuable materials because it's a rentier state. In the case of CAR, we know that there's a lot of gold. And in fact, what we are beginning to theorize is that part of the conglomerate small networks of energy production companies that hire the Wagner Group are really quite interested in this mining basin that runs from Libya through Sudan and then parts of CAR. And it seems that gold is certainly a big interest and focus of the racket, but it also seems that other materials like cobalt and very high value military grade minerals are being sought and being protected by the Wagner Group in these areas.
So there's been a lot of reporting that Wagner is using hit squads to kill members of the Kurdish and Syrian governments and help shape an overall more friendly leadership toward Moscow. Is there any truth to these reports?
Yeah, I think there's probably some truth to that. I mean, just if we look at the history, their history in Donbass, we know that they were connected with the assassination of a number of Donbass rebel generals or commanders who, were getting in the way. They were perhaps intractable or unmanageable. We also know that that probably has occurred in Syria. It's possible that they export this model to other places. But I think the thing that's really important to understand about the Wagner Group is that most of the men who fight for the Wagner Group come from a particular class of special operators who are trained in deep reconnaissance. So in fact, what we're really looking at is guys who are very, very skilled at operating at on a low-grade profile, slipping into countries, operating as tourists, as we say, and then suddenly cropping up to do things like, yes, indeed, decapitate leadership. That is, in fact, the entire mission of Alpha and Wimple was, deep reconnaissance and decapitation. So it would be no surprise whatsoever to find evidence that they had done that in other countries.
So Wagner is also inside the same parent group as the famous Internet Research Agency, the organization that houses the troll farms and the data mining that plays huge influential roles in countries' elections, most famously the US election. Do you think Wagner works in tandem with the IRA? And do you think they work their actions together for maximum effectiveness?
There is no doubt, and there is reliable proof that the subsidiaries that work with the Concord Management Group have hired what are called political technologists that typically accompany operations on the ground by Spetsnaz operators affiliated with the Wagner Group. The paper trail on that is well established. The Dossier Center has done a lot of good work on this with their investigation into the Central African Republic. And there's a clear trail of relationships. And in fact, that really speaks volumes about, again, the real focus here of the Russian state. These political technologists are typically deployed. They have, degrees in anthropology, sociology, right? They're linguists. So they know the regions that they are being deployed to. They are almost always on the same flights as many of the leading operators of the Wagner Group, especially at the outset of an operation. We saw that in Syria, we saw it in Sudan, and we have certainly seen it in Libya, where we have, I think, 2 or 3 Russian nationals affiliated with the Internet Research Agency and various subsidiaries of the Concord Management Group, who are now under arrest for espionage for their involvement in social media propaganda campaigns. So the business model seems to be, we've got some military technical equipment we'd like to give to you, let's say a bunch of tanks. We're going to have an agreement, a military technical cooperation agreement. And by the way, if you're interested in maintaining power, I see that you have an election coming up. We do have some advisors who can help you with, some political advice on how to secure the elections, right? That's, I think, the typical model by which we see the IRA and the Wagner Group working cheek by jowl. But then there's another tier, and there's RIAFAN, which is, in the Syrian context, the main propaganda video news outlet that follows the Wagner Group from place to place, glorifying their missions, making sure that there's always a camera ready so something can be uploaded, a clip can be uploaded to YouTube, or a photo can be uploaded to Instagram. So it's a pretty big enterprise, actually. It's highly integrated.
So it seems the main theatre everyone's involved with at the moment is Syria. So what is Wagner's endgame in that country?
The main strategic goal of Wagner in Syria has always been to secure energy enterprise. And they have done that. They have succeeded now in pretty much taking most of the most valuable strategic energy infrastructure in the country back for the Syrian government. It has been hotly contested, as you know, in February 2018. Their attempt to do so at the ConocoPhillips gas plant near the Euphrates River, which is right on the deconfliction line, led to the deaths of probably upwards of 200 to 250 Russian and Syrian fighters who were killed in a U.S. battle there. So that has always been their main goal, and it remains so. They will likely be involved in securing infrastructure for a very long time to come. There's still work to be done to connect Syria's pipeline infrastructure to Latakia, and you may have noticed this, or it's actually sort of a little bit under the radar, little news reports about mysterious attempts to cut those pipelines that lead into Latakia underwater. And it seems like somebody's finally gotten the notion that it's important to make it difficult strategically for Russia to continue to operate its pipelines there. So that's one of the main real reasons. And the other, of course, is to ensure that any Russian state enterprises that are doing business with the Syrian government are able to do so safely. That's the main objective.
So what's next? Where is Wagner likely to pop up in over the next few years?
Well, I think there are certainly reasons to be concerned about Belarus. I think there's, this debate that is now going on in Belarus over whether or not to, join in the Eurasian Union as proposed by Putin. is one that sort of mirrors what we saw in Ukraine back in 2013, 2014. And there is more pushback this time, right up front from Belarus. At the same time, there's very large Russian-speaking population there. I mean, Belarus is essentially, an extension in some ways of Russia. Historically, there's always been this sort of very blurry line between the Russian state and what is Belarus today. So I would not be surprised if, for some reason, Russia's energy enterprise interests were threatened there, or its economic interests were threatened there, that we didn't see a reprise, right, of what we saw in Ukraine with little green men there. I also would be unsurprised to see any sort of cropping up in Algeria. The Russian state also has a huge enterprise in Algeria, and if it detects any sort of sense of instability there, it will be first in with little green men in Algeria. And that would be easy to do, easy to insert from Libya, easy to insert from Sudan and other places. There's a great deal of cooperation, of course, as you know, between Russia and Egypt today militarily. I don't see little green men necessarily popping up in Egypt, but that degree of cooperation affords Russia the ability to operate pretty much with impunity, across North Africa. So if we see instability there in a way that threatens Russia's enterprises vis-a-vis energy and or arms shipments, then we certainly could expect to see them there.
PMCs have been bubbling under the surface for a long time, gaining more and more influence in their respective nations. They allow countries to order abhorrent actions and then turn around and tell the cameras they had nothing to do with it. They allow a country to effectively invade another country through proxy. Except this time, it's not limited to just nation states. Corporations can now wield the full armed forces that governments once had a monopoly on. For now, this hasn't produced too much blowback, but I'm sure it will do soon, as countries continue to greenlight illegal actions under the misguided thought that the populace it's inflicted upon will not turn around and see through the single degree of separation between the actions inflicted and the person paying for it. The even scarier bit is knowing that, particularly with the American PMCs, that many of them would turn around and work actively against their own country under the orders of the highest bidder. And it may be going on now, with America's largest PMC, the one frequently having meetings in the White House, being based in Hong Kong and having its biggest shareholder being the Chinese government. The whole concept is so badly regulated and has become such a grey area to almost turn into the Wild West, which is bad when it's a few players but disastrous when it's many of them. If small nations were to pay PMCs to carry out attacks or terrorism on larger nations, we don't really have the legal precedents or know-how to know what to do about it. And I don't think we should wait for someone to test out that theory. Is this the future of war? Or is this an experiment that's already showing its flaws? Only time will tell. But for now, all we can do is watch the money and witness these contract soldiers follow their orders. Thank you so much to everyone who tuned into the show this week. With any luck, this episode will be the one to finally crack 100,000 streams, which will be a huge deal for us. When we started the show in October, we had no idea that it would reach the levels it has. We cannot thank each and every one of our past guests and friends of the show enough for their support and help with this one. If you want to help us out even further, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram on @TheRedLinePod, or you can find myself on Twitter @MikeHilliardOz. You can also find us on Patreon and help donate money to the show to let us chase bigger stories and find more editors and more social media people to get us to a bigger audience. Sean McFate can be found on Twitter @SeanMcFate, and he has an amazing book called The New Rules of War coming out in June, which goes through all of these issues, and I'll be sure to read myself. Alex Kirsch runs the great Depth of Perspective show, which can be found on most major platforms as well as YouTube, and I recommend you check it out. Sahar Khan can be followed on Twitter @KhanSahar1, and you can see some of her great work at the CATO Institute there. Candace Rondeaux can be found on Twitter at Candace Rondeaux, which we'll link in this episode. She's always releasing great papers, and it's amazing to get her on this for this program. As always, the show wouldn't work without the help from our amazing friend Mark Spencer, who provides the additional vocals from the episodes. I highly recommend you go check out his show Climactic. Now more than ever, his show should be front of mind for most people. Thank you, and once again, and please all stay safe in this trying time. No matter how crazy and dark the times have gotten, humans have always got through it. I always remind myself of reading British newspapers from the First World War. That sometimes the papers talked about the war being lost in the summer of 1918, even though they would eventually go on to win it 3 months later, after almost 5 years of war. They couldn't know that they were only 3 months away from victory when the Germans were making their final pushes. Being in the middle of it sometimes clouds your ability to see the big picture, and panic can take over. No matter how dark the time is, no matter how far away the victory is, hope is rarely lost. Defeat is never a guarantee, and victory is always possible. We will be back in a fortnight with another episode. But if you need a friend, or you have questions, or you're going stir crazy, please feel free to hit me up on Twitter. I'm always here to chat and help where I can. Thank you again for all of your support, and I hope you have a good evening, and good luck.